Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone. Here I will present to you about the psychological approaches to language and learning. The first one, I will tell you about language and psychology. In language in psychology, I will present about the five items. The first before the World War II, the second in the interwar period, the third is after World War II or the growth of psycholinguistics. The fourth is the study of language comprehension and production. The fifth is language acquisition in childhood. Okay, I'll tell you about language in psychology before World War II. In the history of psychology, language has always played a certain role, but also at no time has linguistic processes been so much in the center of attention as they have been since the 50s and 60s. Psychology studies the behavior, activities, conduct, and mental processes of human beings from about 1900. Questions of learning, memory, thinking, and intelligence, the higher mental process, were the principal topics of investigation. The interwar years, the studies of the emotions, personality, psychological growth in the child, and the measurement of individual differences become prominent. Much of the early investigation in child psychology between 1870 and 1900 contained remarkably acute observation and sophisticated theoretical discussions on the development of speech in early childhood around 1900, especially studies on memory and mental associations involved the use of the language. For example, often tested in learning and retention of word lists. They indicated that in memorizing, the subject tends to arrange and organize the verbal elements to be learned in some recognized patterns. Okay? The second is in the interwar period. Behaviorism, which was advanced in America as a new approach to psychology in the early decades of 20th century, attributed particular importance to verbal behavior, because speech-enabled behaviorist theory to dispense with such mentalist concept as thinking, which was reinterpreted as subvocal verbalization. During the interwar period, child psychological intelligence was viewed as a good example in feature in which the bio component was perhaps stronger than social aspect. Some of the advanced believe that the interaction between genetic factors and environmental influence has remained a much debated issue. A fresh controversy on this question was provoked by the claim advanced by Chomsky, Penneberg, and others that language development should be viewed as biological rather than as the result of social learning. For many decades, in the interaction between language and other aspects of human psychology, in 1904, Dinet's first effort to measure intelligence relied on knowledge of words in the first language and on the understanding of verbal relationship. Test vocabulary is the one of the example that chooses as one of the best way of assessing the mental status. The use of vocabulary tests as measures of intelligence was the assumption that language growth is dependent upon intellectual growth. The Swiss psychologist Piaget, in his first major work on language and thought in childhood, advanced the thesis that language development and the functional use of language in childhood reflect the mental development of the child. In the middle of 20th century, for some psychologists, the role of language was viewed as a central factor in determining the cognitive and affective states of the individual. Through verbalization, a decisive influence could indirectly be exercised on the way humans think, feel, and regulate their lives. Not all psychologists shared this central view of language. Some were less convinced of such a direct effect of language upon the mental makeup of the individual. They believed that there was a certain parallelism between language growth and mental growth generally, but that this was by no means perfect. Others again believed that a cause and effect relationship work in the opposite direction. They regarded language as dependent upon and a part of cognitive development. In most of the studies of discussion on the psychology of language, it was tacitly assumed that the individual is a monoglot operating in a static and unilingual environment. The aim of studying bilingualism was to find out how damaging it is to intellectual growth if a child operates with two languages rather than one. This implicitly negative approach to bilingualism has prevailed until recent times and is not uncommon even today. A study by Peel and Lambert in 1962 which claimed that bilingualism was not necessarily disadvantageous and could in fact be beneficial to the individual ushered in a major change to a prevailing view. The third is after World War II. This is the start of the growth of psycholinguistics. World War II and the post-war era were periods of much interdisciplinary development. Psychologists had become increasingly aware of the fact that the linguistic concepts they had previously used in their investigation were simply common sense notions of language with which they were familiar as educated persons. Linguists, for their part, also want to coordinate their linguistic studies with those of psychologists. The fourth is the study of language comprehension and production. Psycholinguistics by about 1960 Psycholinguistics by about 1960 firmly established as a border discipline between linguistics and psychology, did not immediately follow Chomskyan direction. To a certain extent, in pursuit, the path set in 1954 by Osgood and Seibock's surveys of theory and research, while these psychological studies did not produce a satisfactory explanation on how a native speaker produces or interprets utterances. They made it clear that the rather simple views of language competence current among some language educators, particularly among second language teachers who had adopted the audiolingual theory, were inadequate. The fifth is language acquisition in childhood. In the review of first language acquisition, McLaughlin points out that of the various ways of conceptualizing the language acquisition process, the most satisfactory is one that takes put the linguistic knowledge and behavior of the child into account. Secondly, it suggests that it is a dynamic process reflecting the child's changing experiences with the linguistic and non-linguistic environment. Thirdly, the process is gradual and reflects the child's cognitive growth. Finally, it is a process which is not narrowly linguistic but includes, besides phonological and syntactic development, the acquisition of communicative skills through interaction with the social environment. In short, the language development of the child is more and more viewed in the context of the total psychological and social growth in infancy and childhood. It means that language acquisition in childhood is taken from the social and the first language of the child. Okay, this is the table. In the after World War II, the growth of psycholinguistics. According to this diagram, the entire field of language study is exolinguistics, more recently often referred to as macrolinguistics. Linguistics is, in the narrower sense, microlinguistics is given a somewhat wider range than was envisaged by Bloomfield. The place of psycholinguistics was defined in the following terms. The rather new discipline coming to be known as psycholinguistics is concerned in the broader sense with relations between message and the characteristics of human individuals who select and interpret them. In a narrower sense, psycholinguistic studies those processes whereby the intention of speakers are transformed into signal in the culturally accepted code and whereby the signals are transformed into the interpretations of hearing. In other words, psycholinguistics deals directly with the process of encoding and decoding as they relate states of message to states of communicators. The next is a second diagram intended to map out the major divisions of psychologists. Make it clear that psychology, in the top half of the model, analyzed person as communicator, while linguistic in the bottom half studied the communications or message. Okay, this second diagram made it clear that psychology in the top half of the model analyzed person as communicators, while linguistic in the bottom half studied the communication or message. Psycholinguistics then was the meeting ground between the two. The first is the linguistics analysis was conceived not only as linguistic in the narrow sense but included paralinguistics features or facial and bodily gestures or kinesics and situation. The psychological analysis of communicators was envisaged comprehensively as directed to cognition, motivation, motivational and dispositional sets, and sensoric motor skills. The model extended the Saussurean's distinction between sensoric, syn, synchronic and diachronic linguistics to psychology and psycholinguistics. Diachronic, applied to psychology, refer to students of different stages of development in learning in an individual. Diachronic psycholinguistics therefore involves comparison between two or more stages in language development in the individual and in society. It includes first language learning, second language learning and bilingualism, and the phenomenon of language change. Second language learning and bilingualism were thus given a distinct place in this theme of psycholinguistics. What from our perspective is particularly interesting is that in this first mapping out of psychologists, second language learning and bilingualism were treated as interrelated psychological phenomena and that they were not treated separately but placed squarely, however briefly, into the theoretical framework of a psychology of language. The psychology of the time appear to have favored a coordinate approach as superior to a compound one, and by this bias dismissed the theoretical value of the distinction. Okay, next. The next is about the psychology of learning. There are two types of psychology of learning. The first is the theoretical and experimental study of learning. The second is the empirical study of learning in educational setting. The theoretical and experimental study of learning. The theoretical This theoretical, which developed in the first half of the 20th century, produced a whole array of theories. The related experimentation is called theories of learning. This theory of learning is explained that the experimentation was carried out the animals as a subject of the study. From this study can be understood as a systematization advanced by different psychologists. Learning theories like linguistics theories or school of psychology are known by the name of the chief exponent or salient conceptual feature. The psychology of learning is a study of learning phenomena which disregards the intentions, the thinking, the conscious planning, and interval process of learners. The first is Skinner's operant conditioning and the teaching machine. In the 50s, Skinner, that working in the psychology department of Harvard University, describes his animal teaching machine in a book with the Holland in 1961 with the title Applied to Human Learning. The experience he had gained from these experimental studies on pigeon, and the article on learning, teaching, and teaching machines captured the imagination of educators. In 1954, 1958, and 1961, he argued that if the slowly pigeon can be trained by skillful control on the environment, how much more human beings learn if we only arrange in the learning environment in a more deliberate manner. The terms that describe his argument is a hungry pigeon is permitted to move about in a small enclosed space with transparent walls. On one wall is mounted a food magazine, a magnetically operated dish of grain that can be raised within reach of the pigeon when the demonstrator presses a hand switch. With these laboratory devices and suitable experimental method, we have learned much about the way animal behavior can be shaped into intricate patterns by the use of reward, or as we prefer to call it, reinforcement. Here, Skinner used the pigeon for the subject of the study. Skinner's um, need to know about the response of the pigeon when the Skinners want the pigeon do something that he wants, and the pigeon can do it. So the Skinners will be give the pigeon a food. The second is Precious teaching machine. The possibility of constructing a teaching machine had been recognized before Skinner in 20s by Pressey, an American psychologist at Ohio State University. Based on the Pressey's argument, they developed a machine that actually tested achievement by presenting the learners with questions and multiple choice. The possibility of using this device as a teaching machine was clear to Pressey. But the educational world of the 20s and 30s was not as responsive to Pressey's suggestion as it was 20 years later to Skinner. The third is Crowder's teaching machine and program instruction. From the late 50s, Crowder's experiment on program instruction in language teaching, Crowder's proposed a branching program which enabled learners of different abilities to advance more slowly and more rapidly. The next is cognitive approach by Gestalt, the psychologist. Gestalt's pattern or configuration had laid emphasis on organizing principles in human perception, cognition, sensory motor, skills, learning, and even social conduct. The theory of Gestalt does not regard repetition or practice, the mechanical stamping, as characteristic human learning. Gestalt was able to throw light on the perceptual and cognitive learning by describing and demonstrating the subjective cognitive experiences of the learners with such concepts as whole and part, integration and differentiation, figure and ground, field structure and organization. Brunner and Cagney have adopted a less extreme point of view. The next is Brunner and Gagne. Brunner and Gagne have adopted a less extreme point of view. The certain kinds of learning are adequately covered by a behaviorist stimulus response theory, but conceptual learning on the learning of the principle require a cognitive theory. Brunner's persuasive presentation of a strongly cognitive approach to school learning made a powerful impact on curriculum development in the 60s, particularly in the natural science, social science, and mathematics. But its very relevance to language teaching was left unrecognized until very much later. Gagne identifies 5 learning strategies. The first is learning intellectual skills, concept and rules, learning problem solving or cognitive strategies, verbal information learning, motor skill learning, and learning of attitude, and the concept learning tasks such as learning a language might in fact involve the several or indeed all kinds of learning. The next I will present about the empirical study of learning in educational setting. Here are the practical learning situations. The first, the learning of school objects. The second, the learning of children with educational or emotional difficulties. The third is questions of work training in industry. The fourth, problem of rehabilitation and re-education of individuals requiring remedial treatment. The fifth is the theory and practice of programmed instruction. Okay, the next is about concept of learning in educational psychology. Some of the textbook about psychology of learning usually represent the two sources of learning. The first is the theoretical and the second is experimental studies of learning and the applied investigation of specific learning problems. The categories of psychology of learning refers to the first is characteristics of the learners and individual differences among learners. It means that like ability, personality, attitudes, motivation. The factors that usually presented in the literature include the influence of age and maturity on mental development and learning, the effect of heredity and environment on ability and achievement, specific aptitude for particular learning tasks, example, musical aptitude, manual dexterity, and also language learning aptitude. And then the influence of home and community on motivations and attitude that impact the learners to attend to learning tasks and the degree to which the learners are prepared to persevere with it. Second, the different kind of learning. Here are three measures about the different kind of learning. The first is conceptual and verbal learning, includes information, knowledge, ideas, concepts, and system of thought. Second, skill learning refers to the acquisition of sensory motor process, for example, showing, drawing, writing, playing a musical instrument, or acquiring a new movement combination, and etc. And affective and social learning refers to the acquisition of emotional conduct and expression interests, social aptitudes, and values. The third, the learning processes. Learning processes is one of the concept of learning in educational psychology. The learning processes, it means that the time scale of learning. It means that the time when the student study or learning, it will be make the knowledge and of the student can be increasingly. The second, the contrast between rote and mechanical learning and insightful, meaningful, or cognitive learning differs on the degree on conceptual understanding of the learning text. The third, the opposition between sudden restrictions in the single trial learning, once and for all learning, and gradual learning indicate not only different speeds of learning but also different mental processes involved. The next, self-directed learning can be distinguished from other directed learning. And the last, the conditions of practice have been investigated. Okay, the last point is about outcomes of learning. The needs of assessing the outcomes of the learning have led to the development of tests of achievement and proficiency. So we need to know the outcomes of the process of the learning. We need to find the technique to measurement and evaluation and the applicable of the psychometric language testing. Okay, I think that's all. Thanks for your attention. See you on the next meeting. If you have any question about this material, please comment. And wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.